Elena had always been drawn to forgotten places, where time seemed to stand still and secrets whispered from every corner. The antique shop on Maple Street had been calling to her for weeks, its dusty windows and faded sign promising mysteries beyond imagination. Today, she finally pushed open the creaking door, bells chiming softly as she stepped into the musty interior. Rows of forgotten treasures lined the walls, each item holding stories of lives long past. But it was the mirror that captured her attention, standing alone in the far corner like a forgotten queen. Its ornate iron frame twisted and curled with gothic patterns that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The glass surface appeared clouded, as if breathing with its own life. Elena felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing her closer. Her reflection seemed distorted, features shifting subtly in the dim light. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and touched the cold metal frame. The shopkeeper's eyes followed Elena's every movement as she made her purchase, his ancient face creased with concern rather than joy at the sale. There was something unsettling about his gaze, as if he could see beyond her intentions. The mirror felt heavier than it appeared, its weight settling strangely in her arms as she carried it toward the door. The old man's voice stopped her just before she left, his words barely above a whisper yet somehow cutting through the silence like a blade. He spoke of careful handling, of respecting old things, of not looking too deeply into its surface. Elena nodded politely, dismissing his warnings as the eccentric ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time surrounded by dusty relics. The truth was, she had already made up her mind about what she would do with her new acquisition. The mirror would look perfect in her apartment, a conversation piece that would impress her friends and hide her growing loneliness. The journey from the antique shop to her apartment had been longer than Elena remembered, the mirror growing heavier with each step as if it were feeding on her energy. By the time she reached her door, her arms ached and her breath came in short gasps. The building's hallway seemed darker than usual, shadows clinging to corners and dancing at the edges of her vision. She fumbled with her keys, the mirror's weight making simple tasks nearly impossible. When she finally managed to unlock her door, she was surprised by how eager she felt to be rid of her burden. The apartment welcomed her with its familiar emptiness, the silence broken only by her own breathing and the soft thud as she leaned the mirror against the wall. But something was wrong. The mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its surface no longer reflecting the hallway but showing glimpses of something else entirely. Night fell quickly that evening, bringing with it an unnatural stillness that made Elena's skin crawl. She had placed the mirror in her living room where it would catch the morning light, but now its dark surface seemed to absorb what little illumination the moon provided. Curiosity overcame caution as she approached the glass, drawn by an inexplicable need to look deeper. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The features were hers, yet twisted, eyes too wide, smile too sharp. She blinked, and the distortion remained. Then she saw them, shadowy figures moving just beyond the surface of the glass, their forms indistinct but undeniably present. Panic began to rise in her chest, but she couldn't look away. The mirror was showing her something, revealing secrets that had been buried for centuries. Her own face began to change in the reflection, features becoming gaunt, eyes hollow with terror. The moment her breath touched the mirror's surface, something reached back. Cold fingers of shadow grasped at her from within the glass, their touch like ice against her skin. Elena tried to pull away, but an invisible force held her in place, her face pressed against the cursed surface. The mirror's frame began to pulse with a sickly light, casting dancing shadows across her apartment walls. Within the glass, faces appeared and disappeared, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes filled with centuries of torment. She could feel them trying to push through, desperate to escape the prison that had held them for so long. Her own reflection had vanished, replaced by scenes of horror that made her blood run cold. The hands grew stronger, their grip on her shoulders becoming more solid, more real. She could feel herself being pulled toward the mirror, toward whatever darkness lay waiting beyond the glass. The force released her suddenly, sending Elena sprawling across her living room floor. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the polished wood as she tried to put distance between herself and the mirror. But there was nowhere to go. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering with each panicked breath she took. The mirror stood behind her like a gateway to hell, its surface no longer showing her reflection but revealing glimpses of a realm beyond comprehension. Dark mist swirled within the glass, and shadowy figures began to emerge, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. She could hear them now, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices speaking in languages that predated human memory. The air grew cold, so cold that her breath formed visible clouds, and she realized with growing horror that she had made a terrible mistake. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time losing all meaning as Elena cowered in the corner of her apartment. The mirror had become a window into her deepest fears, showing her scenes that made her question her sanity. Memories she had buried rose to the surface, twisted and corrupted by whatever force now inhabited the cursed glass. She saw herself as a child, alone and afraid, parents arguing behind closed doors. The mirror showed her teenage years, the loneliness that had driven her to seek comfort in all the wrong places. Each memory was distorted, made darker, more painful than she had ever allowed herself to remember. The supernatural force was feeding on her terror, growing stronger with each tear that fell down her pale cheeks. She tried to close her eyes, to block out the visions, but they continued to play behind her eyelids. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, promising to show her everything she had ever tried to forget. The mirror could contain itself no longer. With a sound like breaking glass that never actually broke, dark tendrils of mist and shadow erupted from its surface, reaching toward Elena with hungry intent. She screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through her apartment and beyond, but there was nowhere to run. The supernatural force that had been trapped for centuries was finally free, and it was hungry for more than just her fear. The tendrils wrapped around her arms, cold as death, pulling her toward the mirror with irresistible strength. Her furniture crashed to the floor as the supernatural energy swept through the room, papers flying like autumn leaves caught in a hurricane. The mirror's frame blazed with an intense light that hurt to look at, and within the swirling mist, she could see dozens of faces, all screaming, all reaching for her with desperate hands. When morning light finally filtered through her apartment windows, Elena lay still on the floor, her dark hair spread around her head like a tragic crown. The mirror stood behind her, its surface once again showing only her reflection, though if one looked closely, shadowy figures could still be seen moving just beyond the glass. Her apartment was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered, but now there was an unnatural stillness that made the air itself seem heavy with dread. The mirror's frame had returned to its normal appearance, no longer glowing with supernatural energy, yet something fundamental had changed. Elena's eyes were open, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. The curse had found its vessel, and in doing so, had finally achieved what it had been seeking for centuries. But the mirror was not finished. It never was. The antique shop remained unchanged, its dusty windows still catching the afternoon light, its shelves still lined with forgotten treasures waiting for new owners. The elderly shopkeeper stood behind his counter, his ancient face creased with the same concern he had shown Elena, though she would never know it. A new customer had entered, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had called to her weeks before. He was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, with curious eyes and an eager smile that would soon fade. His fingers reached toward the ornate mirror, just as Elena's had, and the shopkeeper's voice rose in the same whispered warnings. But like Elena, this young man dismissed the old man's concerns, already imagining how perfect the mirror would look in his apartment. The cycle was beginning again, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass, the shadowy figures waited patiently for their next opportunity to escape.